This item is a continuation of an item from November 8th. On November 8th, the City Council adopted an urgency ordinance that imposed a temporary moratorium on non-medical marijuana uses within the city. The item was placed on the November 8th agenda in anticipation of the passage of Proposition 64, which was approved by the voters and took effect on November 9th. And the effect of the moratorium, which took effect immediately upon passage on November 8th, was to essentially put a freeze on the status of non-medical marijuana uses within the city, pending staff's development of permanent regulations with respect to non-medical marijuana. The initial moratorium will be in effect for 45 days. It expires on December 23rd. This hearing is required by the government code to take place 10 days before the expiration, for staff to make a report and for council to approve a report, and also for council to consider potential extension of the moratorium for a period of 10 months and 15 days, pending the completion of permanent regulations with respect to non-medical marijuana use. I do have a PowerPoint present. Let me back up. So the action items that are being requested of council are one, to accept and approve the report by staff, to provide direction as to the types of regulations for permanent regulation of non-medical marijuana in the city, and also to consider adoption of an extension of the moratorium for an additional 10 months and 15 days. And I do have a PowerPoint presentation queued up that will assist us in our discussion. And I believe the city clerk, I don't know if he has the remote for this. So, let's see. Which button do I push here? Okay. Oh, there we go. There. Oh. Not getting the advancement. Well, we'll just do it manually. So can you go to the next slide? So just to give the council a background on the status of marijuana regulation prior to Prop 64. So the city banned medical marijuana dispensaries and cultivation pursuant to the state statutes that allowed regulation of medical marijuana. And state law prohibited simple possession, use, sale, and cultivation of recreational marijuana. Those were all covered by the Health and Safety Code and the Penal Code, and prosecuted by the District Attorney's Office. Next slide, please. So after the passage of Proposition 64, marijuana possession, use, and cultivation in certain amounts was legalized by persons 21 years of age or older. And a regulatory framework was created for commercial marijuana activities. The state was to issue licenses beginning January 1, 2018 for various marijuana activities. Prop 64 doesn't preempt or take the place of the existing medical marijuana laws that are on the books right now. Next slide. So as I stated before, the temporary moratorium was adopted on the 8th. It took effect immediately, and it prohibited outdoor cultivation for personal use, which means, in shorthand, someone growing marijuana in their backyard. Prohibits deliveries to locations in Antioch and from locations in Antioch to other locations. And it prohibits any type of commercial activity that would be licensed under Prop 64. So we're talking about commercial marijuana farms, we're talking about marijuana stores, laboratories that test marijuana, laboratories that process and manufacture marijuana edibles and products and things of that nature. Next slide, please. So as I stated earlier, our current moratorium expires on the 23rd, and it may be extended for a period of 10 months and 15 days with a 4/5 vote of the council. And staff's recommendation is that it's necessary to allow us to craft permanent regulations based on the direction that the council gives this evening. Next slide. So generally, we're asking what approach the council would like to take with respect to non-medical marijuana uses. The most restrictive approach allowed by state law now, as it exists, is to prohibit outdoor cultivation on private property for personal use. To impose regulations on indoor cultivation on private property, because Prop 64 does not allow cities to completely prohibit indoor cultivation at a private residence. A prohibition of all commercial activities, so there would be no retail stores, no commercial farms, nothing of that nature, and to prohibit all deliveries. So no deliveries originating within the city and no deliveries being made to locations within the city. A less restrictive approach would be to allow some level of outdoor cultivation on private property for personal use, subject to regulations that staff could craft. Again, there's also a regulation of indoor cultivation, allowing some commercial activities subject to regulation and imposition of taxes if that's what the council wished, and to allow deliveries to originate in Antioch and to be made into the city. Next slide, please. So with respect to outdoor cultivation, the choices are either to allow it or excuse me, to prohibit it altogether or to allow it with regulations. And if we were to allow it, some of the considerations would be the odor that's created by the cultivation, the type of security that we would impose on property owners if they were to be allowed to cultivate on their property. Setback, meaning how far from their property line would they be allowed to grow the marijuana plants, and in terms of visibility, would they be required to have it so that it's not visible from the street or a public sidewalk or something like that. So those would be some of the considerations with respect to regulation if council wished to allow some form or allow some level of cultivation on private property. Next slide, please. So with respect to indoor cultivation, again, the city can't prohibit it outright. Prop 64 won't allow us to do it. It only allows us to reasonably regulate indoor cultivation. Under Prop 64, they can cultivate up to 6 plants only. We could, if we were to allow it, we could impose restrictions since we can't prohibit it. We could impose some regulations like comply with building codes, plumbing codes, and electrical codes. We could limit the strength of the grow lights in terms of the wattage and the voltage. We could place limits on the use of gas products and chemicals and things of that nature and impose security requirements. Something to keep in mind with respect to these regulations is that we can't make them so difficult to meet that it becomes a de facto ban on indoor cultivation altogether. So that's a balance that we'll have to strike, and staff will take the first crack at putting together a set of regulations. I do have a set of draft regulations from our outside attorneys who've been assisting with this, and these types of regulations are pretty consistent with what I've seen other cities do. The city of Pittsburgh enacted regulations in anticipation of Prop 64, and their regulations of indoor cultivation include these types of limits on the wattage of grow lights and the use of chemicals and things of that nature. So I expect that we would explore similar regulations with respect to the indoor. Next slide, please. So commercial marijuana activities. So Prop 64 had a fairly extensive list of the types of businesses that could be licensed under the state regulations, and they would include commercial cultivation, manufacturing and processing, testing, distribution, and retail sale. And so the state, at the very least, is authorized to provide business licenses, licenses to operate to those broad categories of businesses. And as I said, the state wasn't required to start issuing those licenses until January 1, 2018. And it looks like there's been some recent news that might even be delayed further out into the future. But in any event, Prop 64 does allow cities to prohibit all of those activities. And even if a state gave a license to a business, if Antioch had a complete prohibition on all types of commercial non-medical marijuana activities, they could not open a business here. Next slide, please. If we were to consider allowing commercial marijuana within the city, some of the considerations would be what type of land use and zoning restrictions would we place on those types of businesses? Where would we allow them to be located? What type of permits would we require, and what would the permit process look like? How many permits would we make available? Would we put a limit on the number of permits that we would allow to be issued? And how would we hand those permits out? Would it be on a first-come, first-served basis, on a lottery system, or a scoring system, or something of that nature? So those are all options in the event the council wanted to explore allowing some level of commercial non-medical marijuana activity. Next slide, please. And so along with that, Prop 64 does allow cities to impose taxes on commercial marijuana activities on top of a tax that's going to be imposed by the state. And for example, on a retail sale, a retail business, a tax could be based on percentage of gross receipts. On a manufacturing or processing business, the tax could be based on square footage. And as with all taxes, it would have to be approved by the voters. Next slide. And the final issue is marijuana deliveries. The city could prohibit deliveries that begin within the city and that terminate within the city. The only thing we can't do is we can't prohibit a delivery business from passing through Antioch and using our local roads. But aside from that, we can prohibit origination and termination within the city. Next slide. So just to reiterate, our council action items for this evening are to accept and approve the staff report, provide some direction regarding a permanent ordinance, and to adopt an extension to our moratorium. That concludes my report. I'm available for questions.
Any questions from council members to our city attorney? Question from council member Tiscarino.
It's stated here that if we do indeed approve an extension, you can extend it for up to an additional 10 months and 15 days. My thinking is, I think the reason why we're requesting this particular point is because we need to figure out what we want to do as a city, and for you to give us our report and our options. Realistically, how long do you think that can take to bring back to council?
I think it depends on what council's direction is. If council's direction is that it wants to be the most restrictive as possible and prohibit all uses but impose regulations on indoor cultivation for personal use consistent with Prop 64, we can get something together in short order and have it ready probably by the next meeting in January, if not sometime in February. Our outside legal counsel has provided us with a draft of an ordinance, so it's ready to go. I'll have a final meeting, have some meetings with them to make sure everything looks good and we can put something on fairly shortly. If there's direction to allow some level of the activity, whether it's on the commercial side or cultivation for personal use, it could take a little longer for us to craft the types of regulations. We might even want to come back and have another session to show you what some of the draft regulations look like if we were to go in that direction. So it depends on what the council's direction would be.
And that's where my thinking is I'd like to see all options to determine, where we're going to go as far as extending this if we do decide to extend this or approve this. I want to thank the city clerk. I know Monica, Councilmember Wilson's going to probably speak to this behalf because she requested the results of precincts in the city of Antioch, and I looked at those, and it seemed like every single precinct favored the passage of the marijuana law, and also the only one that I saw that actually opposed it was a small precinct of 3 voters. So So for pretty much, the city of Antioch spoke that they want to see something reasonable within the law. I had spoke a few years ago when we were addressing medical marijuana and the potential of bringing in an organized type of dispensaries out here. I'm still in favor of something like that. But I was willing to wait and see what the new law would do if it was indeed passed by our voters. So I'm looking at all options at this particular point. I'm not opposed to seeing revenue sources coming to the city of Antioch in some way if it's done responsibly. I understand that we need to be really careful. Zoning is really important. I like the fact that we're not able to ban indoor. I mean, that was a purpose, but I can see the need to possibly restrict some of the outdoor cultivation for safety purposes and such. But when I'm looking at this, I'm looking at revenue sources, and that's always been my mindset the whole time when we started addressing this several years ago, and I want to continue that mindset as far as my opinion. So what I'm looking at, if council wants to discuss, is all options put on the table and see where we want to go from there.
This is not up for discussion as of yet, right? These are questions.
Right, and then you could open the public hearing to the public,
Right.
And then we can come back
So
for
any
further
more?
discussion.
So at this point, we're looking for questions from staff. Any other questions? I would like to ask our chief, since he's here, his opinion from a police law enforcement standpoint on this.
Good evening again.
Hold on. Is that Arnie Simons? Is that okay for us to?
Questions or just my opinion on the matter?
Yeah, opinion on the matter, as far as from a police officer standpoint.
Absolutely. I concur with the city attorney. I think that we should postpone this as long as we can for a couple of reasons. One, as Councilmember Tiscarino mentioned, to look at some of the policies or adoptions of these of this matter with other cities, how they're handling it. Because as other cities start to adopt these measures, we're going to see the good and the bad of each one. So it's best to take, in my opinion, take a wait and see, because once we have this, it's harder to make it less restrictive rather than to open it up. In addition to that, I think there's a lot of states that have passed this, and as they try to work through these new changes in laws, there's a lot of misunderstandings about what these laws actually represent. And when we're talking about these precincts that passed this measure, I'm sure a lot of them do want this, but maybe a lot of them don't want it in their backyard, or they don't want to have the associated factors with having businesses such as this, because there are some mitigating issues that police would have to encounter. And I've talked with other police chiefs in other cities that have dispensaries and those sorts of things, and they raise a whole host of issues. So at this time, again, I would say we should probably wait and take a wait and see approach and see what other cities are going to be doing and get more data.
Any other questions of our chief?
Mr. Mayor, just a point of clarification on the extension. So the extension would automatically, if it were approved, would automatically be for the 10-month, 15-day time period, and it can always be terminated prior to that if we enacted some permanent regulations.
Very good, thank you. If there's no further questions of staff, we will open it up for public comments. Open up to public hearing.
And just for clarification, it's a public hearing, and if there's a major proponent, they have an opportunity to speak for 10 minutes. If there's a major proponent, they have an opportunity to speak for 10 minutes. If there is not, each speaker is entitled to 5 minutes.
Do we have a major proponent?
No.
Do we have a public comment?
No. No major proponents, so each get 5.
We have two speakers. Each gets up to 5 minutes. We'll start with Mark Jordan.
guys look good up there. Good evening. Yeah, this is a very gray area because federal law doesn't allow for this. Now state law does. I wanted to comment about this more from the perspective of a real estate issue. In Colorado, when you go to rent a house, some of the ads now say no smokers, no pets, no growers, which I thought was kind of interesting. We have rental registration, although we don't collect all the fees, and this should be added to the rental registration process so that we have some kind of idea about the indoor growth. And council can tell you whether or not you can add a fee for that property being qualified. I don't believe in prohibition. In fact, we have a history in this country that we know it doesn't work. All it created was crime and a very interesting word called scofflaw, which was what was referred to people because so many people drank alcohol when it was illegal. And I agree that we need to look at all of the aspects. This is going to be a major cash contributor to the state of California. And before we have a knee-jerk reaction that, no, we don't want any commercial activity, we don't want any sales, I think we strongly should look at the taxing ability that we would have. I don't believe that we need to be the marijuana capital of California, but I certainly believe that we need to look at it from producing revenue for the city of Antioch. And we need to have some type of registration process, which I believe council would say is appropriate, and whether or not even for indoor growing, there could be some type of registration process so that we actually know, who's doing it, and that they have paid whatever licensing fee, if appropriate, to be able to do that. Look at it from an income generation source. Obviously, people are smoking this. They are enjoying it or not enjoying it, whatever they're choosing to do with it. I look at it as an income source for the city. So I totally agree that we should take some time to evaluate this. Whether or not, or what other cities do, I think we're all big people here. We can make our own decisions. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Brian Eloff.
Yeah, it's Brian Eloff. Thank you, Mr. Wright.
Thank you.
I just want to agree, Mr. Toscanaro, excuse me.
Close enough.
Cheers. Yeah, no reason to put our heads in the sand so quickly. The people of the state have spoken with Prop 64. You said it in your precincts, they've spoken. It gains a lot of respect with you guys and the people you represent if you uphold their opinions and you don't go against their opinions. So I didn't really have anything prepared tonight. I just know that there's a few facts. Colorado is in $2.3 billion in sales, I believe, and at 25%, that's somewhere in $30-something million in tax revenue they brought in. And that's in certain cities that have approved it. They're getting those tax revenue, while other cities are sitting back and getting $0. Well, everything's going great. The kids aren't getting hooked on it. The numbers are going down in Colorado. The system hasn't collapsed. Mayors and council members are changing their minds. Everything's working great. It's this year, November, Colorado hit $10 billion in sales, and the year's not even over yet. That's it. I just think you guys should uphold your community's decision to have marijuana in your community. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more public comments?
No, sir.
If there are no more, this item is closed to the public, and it is now before council for discussion. Councilwoman Wilson.
Yes. So as Mr. Councilmember Tiscarino had stated earlier, I did request to see how the city of Antioch voted on it, and pretty much all precincts have voted yes on Prop 64. But with that being said, I feel that we need to be a little bit strict right now until we set our zoning codes and conditional use permits, getting the parameters set up, so we can acknowledge the vote of our community. But I think for now we should be a little bit strict until once we get policy and procedure and codes and stuff like that all up and ready.
Thank you. Councilwoman Overchuck.
I have a few comments to make. In reading the white paper on marijuana dispensaries, and the federal law clearly and unequivocally states that all marijuana-related activities are illegal. It's federal. It's not just the state of California. It's federal. And there's a list, and if you haven't gone online to look at the agenda packet, this is in the agenda packet, and you can read it for yourself. Colorado's not having fun doing this. They're having a lot of illegal activities and troubles doing this. This is a quality of life issue for me. The League of Cities posted how many criminals are being let out, that were incarcerated, that are being let out in the state of California. That comes into play. The money, to me, I mean, everybody's talking about billions of dollars. It's not about the money. To me, in Antioch, it's about the quality of life that we have here in Antioch. So right now, we don't know enough about this, at how it's going to impact the state of California. And until we understand how exactly it's going to impact it, I think we need to do what our sister cities are doing and ban it at this point until we have more information. Those are my comments.
Thank you. Other council comments?
The only comments I would have is that I do agree with the chief about, as I well know from Measure E, people may be for casinos, but they may not necessarily want them in their backyard. But I also agree with I voted against this. I just don't believe in this. But I did see that 65% of the people in Antioch voted for it. Every precinct did come around to it. I like the parameters that the city attorney has put out here about what approach should Antioch take, and most restrictive versus less restrictive. And I don't think that that's just a question as we consider this 10-month period just for the people in this room. I think it needs to include some of our commissions, like the Economic Development Commission, and they may be looking at it from a very specific angle, maybe the economic development tax revenue side. Maybe there's some opportunity for the Parks and Recreation to see in terms of how we can limit it from outdoor use, whatever it may be. I think it's a larger conversation for the community than just the five of us up here and the people in this room. But I do think I respect the fact that people did vote for this, and they clearly want us to take a look at this. But I don't think it's a conversation absent of the public.
Yes, Councilmember Overchuck.
And it was addressed about the real estate. I don't agree. I think that if people find out that we're allowing this, they may not want it in their backyard, and that may prompt them to move, and it may prompt some of the buyers not to buy in Antioch. And I don't want to see our real estate market declining due to the growth of marijuana. And if there's no further comments,
can I add a comment? Based on what Councilwoman Overchuck said, I think we're speculating, and what we're being asked to do is to come up with which approach we want to take. So making the assumptions you've made, I'm not sure fits into what we're asked to do here. I think we're being asked to do is, are we less restrictive or more restrictive? And so, whether or not someone moves in here as a result, we're being asked to figure out where it should happen and where it shouldn't happen.
Just comments from me. There was a lot of reading for those that did open the packet as far as the white paper, the chiefs in California coming together, as well as the Colorado report. And this is a complicated issue. It is not clear-cut. in Colorado, they are having a lot of problems. Our chiefs of police are all in agreement that this will bring about more crime in a city that is struggling to overcome. And so I think that needs to be thought about as we do. That being said, tonight we are being asked to accept the report. We're being asked to extend the moratorium and then to give counsel to staff as to which of these, and we can have them go back and do both and bring both back to us. So I believe that's what's being brought forward to us. If there's no other comments, I will, yes, Councilmember Tiscarino.
And again, I'm not disputing the fact that we should extend the ordinance. My concern is is it going to be either looking at restrictive or less restrictive? When I'm asking and how it will reflect my vote is, I'm looking to see all options. I would like to see a study on, the pros and cons of what the restrictive and non-restrictive could happen in the city of Antioch as well as other cities. If we're going to basically look at just keeping it as fully restricted, that's going to be hard for me to support that. But I will support the measure if it is established as, looking at all.
If there are no more comments, then I will look for a motion first on accepting of the report.
I will make a comment as far as my comments on real estate. It does have something to do with the quality of life, and I think it's our responsibility as a council to look at the big picture, and that was in this packet. So with that, it is recommended the City Council take the following actions: accept, number 1, accept and approve the report from the City Attorney and Community Development Director and provide direction regarding a permanent ordinance regarding non-medical marijuana uses, and 2, adopt the extension of the interim urgency ordinance establishing a temporary memorandum on non-medical marijuana uses.
Mr. Mayor?
We have a motion. Do we have a second?
On the question?
We do not have there is no second. The motion dies. Your question.
I would entertain the separate votes on 1 and number 2.
Do I hear a motion on number 1?
I'll go ahead and make a motion on number 1 to accept and approve the report from the City Attorney and Community Development Director to provide direction regarding the permanent ordinance regulating non-medical marijuana uses. And
we have a second on number 1. This is open up for. Second was Councilmember Lamar Thorpe. And we call for a vote.
Number 5.
Number 1 passes. Question I have is this says to provide direction regarding. There was nothing in the motion that provided direction to staff.
You don't necessarily have to make a motion on that. It seems like there's a concurrence from at least a majority of the council that it wants to see at least some additional information from staff regarding what the options are if the council were inclined to adopt regulations that would allow some level of commercial as well as personal cultivation and things like that. So I think the direction is pretty clear, and I can take that back to the consultants I'm working with, so we have clear direction and we can come back. So I anticipate that the next time I'm before you on this item will not be with an actual ordinance, but will be another presentation with some potential draft language and at least some broad concepts in terms of what can be done with the different types of regulations with respect to businesses and personal cultivation.
And it sounded to me from council that we're asking for both options, right? A restrictive and a less restrictive option.
Sure, and we can provide a fuller menu of options with respect to both. And so the next item would just be based on would be to extend the moratorium for an additional 10 months, 15 days, and just so that council has full information under the government code. The council can also extend it for another year after the expiration of the 10-month, 15-day extension. And I don't anticipate that it'll take that long to come up with something, but again, keep in mind that it doesn't look like the state is even going to hit its January 1, 2018 target for licensing at this point. If there is a desire to engage in more community outreach and send this to other commissions and boards, there would be plenty of time to do that.
Very good. Thank you. Councilmember Thorpe had a question.
Well, it was in line with what you just said at the end. So I really want to press upon the importance of going back to the Economic Development Commission and having them engaged in this process.
Thank you. Do we have a motion on number 2? Yes, Councilmember Tiscarino.
Since I'm hearing it's clear that we're going to be entertaining or looking at all options at this particular point, I'm going to go ahead and make the motion on number 2 to adopt the extension of the interim emergency ordinance establishing a temporary moratorium on non-medical marijuana uses.
We have a first, Commissioner Thorpe, Councilmember Thorpe, seconds. We call to a vote. All in favor?
There are 5 affirmative votes. The urgency ordinance is adopted.
Very good. Moving on to